Hello, this is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service, with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Jackie Leonard, and at 14 hours GMT on Tuesday, the 12th of November, these are our main stories. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has warned of a prolonged escalation of tensions with Palestinian militants after Israel killed an Islamic Jihad commander. A suspected American fighter from the Islamic State group is trapped on the border between Turkey and Greece after being expelled by Ankara. And Google has signed a deal with a US healthcare provider, giving it access to the medical data of millions of Americans. Also in this podcast.
Pigs might fly, as the old saying goes, but Lilu is getting pretty close to taking off.
We meet Lilu, the world's first airport therapy pig. Whoever thinks that they can hit our citizens and evade our long arm is wrong. We have proven we can hit surgically. The words of the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu after an airstrike killed Baha Abu al-Atta, a senior commander of the Palestinian militant group Islamic Jihad in Gaza. His supporters thronged the streets of Gaza City for his funeral. Mourners carried flags and banners, many chanting slogans, while guns were fired into the air. So just how significant a figure was Baha Abu al-Atta? We heard from our correspondent Tom Bateman, who's in Sderot in southern Israel.
He had become increasingly significant over the last year. He was spoken about more and more within the Gaza Strip because he was the commander of an Al-Quds brigade, that is the military wing of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And he was in charge of several hundred fighters in the north and eastern Gaza Strip. Now that area was significant because of the rising tensions over the last 18 months or so at the perimeter fence, with protests and escalations between Israel and militants in Gaza. He had been seen to be acting increasingly outside of the control of the dominant militant force there, that is Hamas. In particular, around 10 days ago, after dozens of Palestinians did when they were shot by Israeli soldiers, there was a barrage of rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel, which Israel responded to with airstrikes. Now, that was seen as an action that he had taken autonomously or potentially independently, outside of this very kind of loose arrangement between Hamas and the Israelis that had been attempting in difficult circumstances to achieve some sort of calm between the two sides over the last year or so.
Now, Hamas has said that this killing will not pass without punishment. And we're already seeing retaliatory rocket attacks into Israel, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I'm in the town of Sderot. It's just a few miles from the Gaza Strip. And as I speak to you, I'm looking at a building ablaze. There is a column of thick black smoke rising and blocking out the light from the sun at the moment. This was a direct hit from a rocket. It's the building now surrounded by Israeli security forces and police and firefighters trying to douse the flames. We've heard at least 3 blasts in the last hour or so, interceptions, it sounded like Israel's missile defense system trying to intercept rockets from Gaza. The latest figure we had was around 50 or more rockets fired. I think that number's likely to have gone up since then. A couple of people wounded, at least in Israel, from shrapnel. And inside the Gaza Strip, Israeli airstrikes have resumed. The latest is they targeted 2 people on a motorbike that Israel says were a rocket launching unit. One of those people has been killed, but it's clear that we're now in the midst of yet another escalation between these two sides. I mean, you mentioned Hamas. They say that the action this morning of killing Abu al-Atta had crossed a red line and promising a response. As for the Israelis, Mr. Netanyahu has described him as al-Atta as an arch terrorist. He described him as a ticking bomb and said that he was planning an imminent attack and was an imminent threat to Israelis.
We also heard about another Islamic Jihad figure who was targeted in Syria. Is this Israel stepping up its action against that group, against Islamic Jihad?
Well, that report is from Syrian media that the political leader of Islamic Jihad based in Damascus had been targeted, that he was killed in that attack. We've had no independent verification of that, and the Israelis have been asked about it. The Israeli military, they simply haven't commented. I suppose, of course, the context to all of this in the region is the concern about the threat that Iran poses via its partner groups or its proxy groups in the region to Israel. And, that will, of course, provide the context for many. But I thought it was notable that when the Israeli army spokesman was asked about Iran a little earlier this morning, he specifically said that he believed that this particular commander more recently had not been acting under the specific guidance of Iran, but had been he said independently and unchecked was the word he used, that he was a rogue element.
That was Tom Bateman speaking to us from southern Israel. To Saudi Arabia next, and a man has been arrested after 3 members of a theatre group were stabbed during a live performance in Riyadh. Video footage, later posted on social media, appeared to show a man wielding a knife rushing into performers on stage. We heard more from the BBC's Sebastian Usher, who's in Riyadh.
Well, we haven't had that much more information released since the wake of the incident. The Saudis said that they caught a suspect. They described him as a Yemeni. They didn't give a motive for what he had tried to do. Also, reports on the 3 people who were stabbed, saying they were taken to hospital, but they had light wounds. So it's not an incident that is huge in terms of the bloodshed that it's caused, but in terms of shaking up this very new look. I mean, I've just arrived in Riyadh, and the first people that I saw at the airport were dressed up with the logo of Riyadh Season and waiting for people to come off the planes to go and visit it. This is going on for 2 months here, November and December. And, I mean, it is a very, very different place, parts of Riyadh now, than it used to be. Even actually last year when I was last here, there's a lot more that is happening in terms of that entertainment. Now, some Saudi analysts, some pro-government Saudi analysts, has to be said, have said, well, in response to what happened last night, you see, this is what we've been warning against. You have to understand that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's initiated these moves, he has to be careful because there could be a backlash at any time. There are many ultra-conservative elements within the kingdom that want to strike back. And if you go online, you'll see sites which show videos of some of the performances that have been taking place over the last couple of years and being put up as something shameful that Saudi shouldn't be allowing. And that plays to the idea that, essentially Saudi Arabia has to get behind Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, whatever happens, and the rest of the world should too, which, again, I was here last year in the wake of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. That still hangs over Saudi Arabia outside. Inside, obviously, it's far less of an issue now. But, something like this will, in a sense, play to what the government and what MBS, the Crown Prince, wants, which is to give a sense that there are still many things at stake. This is still a risky strategy, and people need to get on board, people inside and outside the country.
That was Sebastian Usher in Saudi Arabia. A suspected former Islamic State fighter has spent the night in the open in no man's land between Greece and Turkey. The man, who's thought to be an American citizen, was expelled from Turkey on Monday, but border guards at what Greece calls the Evros crossing refused to let him in. Here's our Europe regional editor, Mike Sanders.
The man is stuck between the Greek and Turkish border posts on a 200-metre strip of road. At times, he's tried to shout to reporters on the Turkish side, but not with a discernible American accent. The State Department has declined to comment. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who's heading for Washington, said the man's plight was none of Turkey's concern. Mr. Erdogan has begun expelling Islamic State suspects, calling on their countries of origin to take responsibility. Meanwhile, life goes on around the man in no man's land as Greek shoppers traipse past him to snap up Turkish bargains.
That was Mike Sanders. Google has signed a deal with a major healthcare provider in the United States. The deal with Ascension, the second largest medical system in the US, will give Google access to millions of Americans' medical data. Here's a short excerpt from one of Ascension's promotional videos.
Ascension St. Vincent's Cardiology is a leader for heart care. From complex procedures to routine screenings, our cardiologists care for hearts all over the region, using the latest best practices and cutting-edge technology. Our care teams...
Our business correspondent Theo Leggett was asked what sort of medical data Google will have access to.
According to Google, it's covered by rules on access to so-called protected health information, and that can include a number of things, so personal identification information, name, address, phone number and all that sort of thing, but also medical treatment records, social security records and that kind of thing. So there is a lot of information covered by this, and that's where concerns come in and why this has been featured very heavily in the American press. It's because it is a major technology company which is already incredibly powerful, potentially gaining access to very sensitive information.
And what do Google and Ascension say this information will be used for?
Well, they say they have an agreement under which Google will provide services for Ascension. So some of this is pretty basic stuff, cloud computing, storage. But there's also another interesting angle to it, which is the development of AI features to be used in patient diagnosis. So using machine learning to help doctors, in theory, diagnose what's wrong with patients and how to treat them. They say they're not actually doing anything wrong, that all of this is covered by laws, and Google insists that none of this information will be used for any other reason. That said, Google has faced criticism in the past for its handling of sensitive medical data. It's currently facing a lawsuit over its use of medical records provided under a separate deal with the University of Chicago Medical Center. So when you get this kind of collating of sensitive information by the tech giants, privacy campaigners do tend to get up in arms. But as I say, Google insists that this kind of information transfer is actually pretty standard practice in healthcare and that it isn't doing anything wrong.
So the big question, if you're a patient and you're concerned about this, is can you opt out?
No, it doesn't seem that you can. This is, you provide your information to Ascension. Ascension has a deal with Google which involves the transfer of that information, and that it's up to Google to keep that information secure.
That was Theo Leggett. Activists in Hong Kong have again blocked roads and clashed with police a day after some of the most violent unrest during 5 months of pro-democracy protests. Riot police fired tear gas on a university campus and commuters were forced to abandon a train after objects were found on the line. Hong Kong's leader, Carrie Lam, said she hoped universities and schools would urge students not to take part in violence. On Monday, she said the unrest had brought the territory to the brink of no return. And what's the crisis been like for couples who come from either side of the divide? A surprising 30% of all marriages in Hong Kong are between local Hong Kongers and immigrants from mainland China. Our correspondent Paul Adams has been to meet one such couple who've been married for less than a year in the most difficult of circumstances.
You want this one? No. Let's share. Huh?
It's lunchtime. Daniel and Jane are sitting in a booth in their favourite noodle restaurant, discussing chilies.
Hong Kong dishes are not spicy, but where I'm from, we eat spicy food, like our daily food.
Yeah, the staple food in her hometown is some chili fried pork with different kind of chili, green chili, red chili, all together.
Are you always trying to sneak a few chilies into the dish?
I will put some chili on the food he makes.
Jane and Daniel are not their real names. In Hong Kong nowadays, people prefer to be anonymous. These are angry, fractured, suspicious times. Violent protests have been going on for months between young Hong Kongers and the police. After lunch, we settle down on a park bench, city life swirling noisily around us. Like all newlyweds, Daniel and Jane have dreams, or did.
When we married, I actually was skeptic about Hong Kong's future in the next few years. And we had plans of, for example, we wanted to have a flat in Hong Kong, create a family, have a baby or something. But all those plans are now crushed because it's very difficult to feel so optimistic to have a baby when the society is in chaos, right?
How about you, Jane?
I feel in this movement, I become the least welcome person in Hong Kong. Hong Kongers don't like me because I'm from mainland China. My friends think I don't love my country. They said I should fully support Chinese government, whatever their policy.
It's only in the privacy of their own home, a cramped 15th floor apartment, that Jane and Daniel open up about the crisis gnawing away at the heart of their city.
I think Hong Kongers should stay in the system and try to persuade what they want in the system. because they need to wait for the right democratic movement in mainland China, so that will be the opportunity for Hong Kongers to persuade their democratic autonomy.
Do you think that's a realistic possibility?
He said that I am too not practical.
You're too optimistic.
Yeah, but I just have that hope.
I used to be a strong believer in democratic China. I dreamed of being one of the government officials. But as I grow up, I see there is a huge gap between the government and the people. So I decided there has no other way out other than doing something, for example, civil disobedience.
Daniel is coy about his involvement in the protest movement, but clearly regards it as his duty. Jane, whose parents still live in mainland China, is much more nervous.
Lennon Wall over there.
That's a Lennon Wall, right. We go for a wander around their suburban neighbourhood, our route taking us past one of the many so-called Lennon walls, covered in months and months of political posters. On his phone, Daniel shows me one of the many protest apps that have sprung up in recent months.
It somehow shows where there are incidents or conflicts going on, and also there are red alerts, and probably there has to be some sort of conflict going on.
Those conflicts have become more and more violent. Daniel says the movement has no choice and suggests it could still get worse.
Both sides are not short of using lethal force. It's just a matter of time as both sides going into a spiral of violence.
If you'd like to hear more about Daniel and Jane's story, you can listen to the documentary on the BBC World Service. And Daniel and Jane were talking to Paul Adams. Still to come in this podcast.
I'm dumbfounded that this government won't release the report about Russian influence, because every person who votes in this country deserves to see that report before your election happens.
Hillary Clinton has condemned a British government decision not to release a report on alleged Russian political interference ahead of the UK election. A vast area of Australia's east coast, including Sydney, is under threat of catastrophic conditions as bushfires continue to rage. More than 50 blazes are burning across the state of New South Wales. Temperatures have been rising towards 40 degrees, and a strong southerly wind is due to sweep up the coast, making the situation even more dangerous. Australia's fire service says in some areas it's now too late for people to leave. Poppy Brown is from the Australian Red Cross.
It's a really unprecedented situation in the state at the moment, and there's been, over 1 million rugby pitches burnt already. We know that most populous areas in terms of Sydney, Wollongong and Newcastle are facing this catastrophic fire danger at the moment. We are in a state of emergency.
Carol Sparks is the mayor of Glen Innes, where 2 people have died and dozens of homes have been destroyed.
We saw it coming but didn't account for the 80 kilometres an hour winds, which pushed it onto our property with lots of embers and sparks and all sorts of things like that. And it just ignited, basically, and homes were completely burnt to the ground.
We heard more from our correspondent in Sydney, Phil Mercer.
We now know that more than 70 fires are burning across New South Wales, about half of that number out of control, often in terrain that's rugged and hard to reach. We do know that more homes have been destroyed. 3,000 firefighters have been preparing for what officials here have said was the most dangerous bushfire week Australia's most populous state has ever seen, and a catastrophic fire warning was issued for the first time here in Sydney, and even homes a short distance from the city centre were at risk. We were in one suburb about half an hour's drive north of the Harbour Bridge, where a bushfire came perilously close to a row of houses, and that fire was only extinguished by the very swift response of emergency service personnel on the ground and water-bombing aircraft in the sky.
So that's near Sydney. What about the rest of the state?
Well, to the north, near the city of Newcastle, and the south to the city of Wollongong, these catastrophic fire warnings were issued earlier. Also to the west, in the Blue Mountains, perilous conditions there too. And you have to remember that it's not just in this part of New South Wales. Many serious fires have burnt for a very long time to the north of New South Wales, across the border into the state of Queensland. Many fires are burning there too. So this is a continuing bushfire emergency spanning 2 states. You mentioned that very strong southerly change, bringing very strong winds up from the south. That's expected to exacerbate the fire conditions in the coming hours. But mercifully, here in New South Wales on Wednesday, the extreme conditions are likely to dissipate, allowing much respite for those emergency services, crews, and also hard-pressed residents as well.
And just briefly, Phil, a lot of people have been told to get out. Where are they going?
Friends, relatives, evacuation centres, even shopping centres was the advice. And earlier, the Premier of New South Wales, Gladys Berejiklian, said, and I quote her, she said, "For heaven's sake, stay away from bushland." Residents urged in very good time, or to leave in very good time, from those bushfire-prone regions.
That was Phil Mercer in Australia. The main opposition party in Britain, the Labour Party, says it's been the subject of a large-scale cyber attack just over 4 weeks before the country holds a general election. The party said in a statement that the attack on its digital platforms had failed. Here's our digital election reporter, Joe Tidy.
The cyber attack on the Labour Party was a distributed denial of service, or DDoS attack. This is when hackers direct huge amounts of internet traffic at a target in an effort to overwhelm a computer system, in the same way a website crashes when too many people try to log on at the same time. Labour says campaign software was hit yesterday afternoon, slowing systems down or reducing functionality. But thanks to what the party calls robust security systems, nothing was taken completely offline. DDoS attacks vary a great deal in size and sophistication. Small attacks on websites can be launched from a hacker's bedroom with an off-the-shelf ready-made kit. Others aimed at disrupting big targets like multinational corporations can be far more complex and rely on hundreds of thousands of internet-connected devices that make up a botnet.
That was Joe Tidy. And staying in Britain, the former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has said it's shameful that the government here hasn't yet published a parliamentary report on alleged Russian interference in British politics. Speaking to the BBC, the former US presidential candidate said it was undemocratic not to allow people to see it before the election.
Every person who votes in this country deserves to see that report before your election happens. That should be an absolute condition, because there is no doubt. We know it in our country. We have seen it in Europe. We have seen it here, that Russia in particular is determined to try to shape the politics of Western democracies, not to our benefit, but to theirs.
Our security correspondent Gordon Carrera told us more about the report.
It's a report simply entitled Russia by the Intelligence and Security Committee, which is the UK Parliament's oversight body over the intelligence agencies. And it's been looking at the issue of Russian influence, espionage and subversion in a number of places, but including in the UK. Now, we know, as Hillary Clinton was talking about, that there has evidence been produced in things like the Mueller inquiry about lots of Russian alleged interference in the American political system and in her election in 2016, which she lost to Donald Trump. But there's always been this question, was there a similar kind of campaign in the UK around elections and around the Brexit referendum in 2016? And this report from the Intelligence and Security Committee was, if you like, the closest thing the UK was getting to a Mueller inquiry to try and answer that question. It was completed by the committee, it went to Downing Street, but then the election was called and Downing Street said there was not enough time to publish it before the election.
So that the government's saying that it's simply not enough time. That's why it's not releasing it.
That's their argument, that there's a process that has to be followed with these reports. But the chair of the committee itself, Dominic Grieve, said that he simply doesn't buy that. And so it's led to a lot of speculation. Is there something embarrassing in this report? How explosive could it be? I think it's unlikely there's something suggesting a large-scale Russian campaign which was successful in, or at least in the way that was seen in the US. But there could be some embarrassing details about party funding, for instance, and about Russian influence, which people didn't want to come out. But they've maintained this line that it's about the process. And so it doesn't doesn't look like people will see this report this side of the election in December.
Oh, that's interesting. So however much pressure the government is put under to release it, it seems unlikely that that's going to happen.
It does seem unlikely because Parliament has actually been dissolved, it's risen, and this is a parliamentary committee, so the process for publishing it would be very hard. So I think we're not likely to see it, but that just means there's going to be more questions and more speculation about what might be in it.
That was Gordon Carrera. Newark, in the state of New Jersey, is the latest American city after Flint, Michigan, to face outrage over elevated levels of lead found in the drinking water. Now, the mayor has announced a $120 million plan to speed up the replacement of all lead service pipes in order to remove the toxic threat. And he's called on the federal government to urgently help other cash-strapped municipalities modernise their water infrastructure. Health experts say there is no safe level of lead in water and that high exposure has impact on mental and physical development. The BBC's Neda Tawfiq went to Newark to hear residents' concerns.
It's time for dinner, and Alika Spite is making pasta with her 3 young kids. But to boil it, only bottled water will do. She lives in Newark, New Jersey, the latest American city to grapple with a lead water crisis.
I cook with it so that way it'll be a little safer. I don't want anything happen to my kids.
Officials have given her a filter, but she is still fearful, especially since her 3-year-old son, Kion, already has lead poisoning from past exposure to it in their home. The city removed the dangerous toxin, but now her concern is the water from her faucet.
I spend more money on water than buying food for the house.
Newark's problem comes from old lead pipes that remain in place even though they were banned decades ago. Traditionally, adding certain chemicals to the water has prevented the pipes from corroding and kept the water lead-free. But when that anti-corrosion treatment failed at one of the water plants, a third of the city was affected. Officials switched to a new agent, but it will take months to be fully effective.
On this residential street in Newark, lined with older homes, there are crews here from the city pulling out the lead pipes that lead to the homes, and they are replacing them with copper ones. There are 18,000 homes across Newark that have lead piping, and the city wants to, in the next 2 years, replace all of them.
Mayor Baraka says removing the lead service lines will be a permanent fix to the elevated lead levels, which are some of the highest recently recorded by a large water system in the United States. In the meantime, he says filters handed out by the city are working.
We can't rely completely and totally on corrosion control. And I think that's where we have handicapped ourselves nationally throughout this country, and we've done that in Newark. So we've used the corrosion control, and the corrosion control that we used is still on the EPA's website as something that's safe to use.
Still, some members of the community believe officials have been slow to respond to the crisis and warn residents. Yvette Jordan with the Newark Education Workers Caucus is part of a lawsuit against the city launched by the NRDC, a national environmental organization.
I still am unsure about when I am getting lead service line replacement, even though I put in for it over 6 months ago.
It's the same movie over and over again. It seems like, unfortunately, we're unable to learn from our mistakes.
Mark Edwards is a professor of civil engineering at Virginia Tech. He helped expose contaminated water in Flint, Michigan, and years ago in Washington, D.C.
Residents all around the United States are wondering, how can I trust my water utility? How do I know that I'm not next? And unfortunately, the perception's the reality. Too many Americans, especially in our poorer communities, are spending their precious financial resources on bottled water filters because they don't feel safe anymore.
Come to get some good water, right? Always. All the lead going on still, right?
Yep. Despite assurances from the city, churches and charities continue to hand out bottled water. Efforts may be underway to finally rid Newark of lead pipes, but rebuilding trust could take much longer.
Neda Tawfiq was reporting from New Jersey. A river near the border between North and South Korea has been polluted with blood from the carcasses of thousands of pigs, which have been slaughtered as part of an operation to halt the spread of African swine fever. The area was hit by the virus in September. It's thought to have spread from North Korea, but it appears that efforts to contain the highly contagious illness may have resulted in nearby rivers running red with blood. Laura Bicker reports.
Footage filmed by a citizens group shows red water flowing down a tributary of the main Imjin River near the inter-Korean border. It's thought to have come from the blood of pigs shot to prevent the spread of African swine fever. 47,000 pig carcasses are said to have been piled on a truck at a burial site on the border. But it appears the production of plastic containers to dispose of the bodies was delayed. So when heavy rains fell on Sunday, it resulted in nearby streams being polluted. The local government has taken emergency steps to prevent further pollution and dismissed concerns that the blood poses a health risk. Officials say the carcasses had already been disinfected, so the river water will not spread African swine fever to farms further downstream.
That was Laura Bicker. Global health charities say pneumonia kills more children than any other disease, claiming a life every 39 seconds. The UN Children's Agency and 5 other groups say 800,000 children died of the preventable lung disease last year. They called it a forgotten epidemic. Mayeni Jones reports from the worst affected country, Nigeria.
According to UNICEF's latest analysis, 19% of child deaths in 2018 in Nigeria were due to pneumonia. The lung disease was also the biggest killer of children under 5 the previous year. The UN agency says causes of child pneumonia in Nigeria include malnutrition, indoor air pollution from burning charcoal, as well as outdoor air pollution. Pneumonia is an infection that affects the lungs, filling them with fluid or pus. Besides Nigeria, 4 other countries are responsible for more than half of global child pneumonia deaths. This includes India, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of Congo and Ethiopia.
That was Mayeni Jones in Nigeria. In San Francisco, a rather unusual member of staff can be spotted among the corridors and departure gates of one of the city's airports. Sporting a pilot's cap and pink toenails, 5-year-old Lilu is helping stressed travellers have a more enjoyable journey. Gareth Barlow reports on the world's first airport therapy pig.
Pigs might fly, as the old saying goes, but Lilu is getting pretty close to taking off. At least she's certainly taken off with passengers at San Francisco's International Airport.
I've never seen one here, so it's interesting. It's fun. I got really excited.
She can do tricks like a dog.
You know, the nails, the hat. I don't even really know how to explain it, but it's actually real cool.
Lilu is part of the WAG Brigade, which uses therapy animals, including the world's first airport therapy pig, to cheer up travellers and ease the stress of flying.
But everybody's usually very happy, and it makes them pause for a second, smile, and be like, oh, wow, it's great. Snap out of the moment.
A musician, a style icon, and a social media star. The only thing Lilu can't do is visit duty-free.
That was Gareth Barlow. And that's it from us for now, but there will be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. If you would like to comment on this podcast or the topics we've covered in it, or if you'd like to send us pictures of your therapy animal, or if you have any suggestions for the Happy News Pod, you know, the sort of thing, funny, inspiring, heartwarming stories for the roundup of the happiest news stories of the year, which will be recorded next month, just send them to our normal address. It's globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jackie Leonard, and until next time, goodbye.